Flight 728 lifted smoothly from Denver International Airport, bound for Seattle on a clear afternoon. Passengers settled into their seats as the plane climbed steadily to cruising altitude. The hum of the engines blended with quiet conversations and the rustle of magazines. In seat 18, sat 12-year-old Emily Parker, traveling alone for the first time to visit her grandparents. She pressed her face lightly against the window, watching clouds drift by. Flying had always fascinated her. It felt familiar, comforting, like a connection to something she deeply loved and missed. Emily's fascination with aviation came from her father, a former flight instructor who had passed away 2 years earlier. Before his death, he spent countless evenings teaching her the basics of flight using simulators and diagrams. He never imagined she would need those lessons, but he believed knowledge built confidence. Emily remembered his calm voice explaining instruments, autopilot functions, and emergency procedures. As the aircraft leveled off at 35,000 feet, she tightened her seatbelt and opened her notebook, where she liked to sketch airplanes and write down flight details. About an hour into the flight, the cabin lights flickered briefly. The plane dipped slightly, enough for a few passengers to glance up from their screens. No announcement followed. Inside the cockpit, something had gone terribly wrong. A rare malfunction in the oxygen system caused a sudden drop in breathable air. Both pilots, focused on troubleshooting, were affected almost simultaneously. Within moments, they lost consciousness at their controls. The autopilot still engaged, but alarms quietly warning of a growing problem. In the cabin, flight attendants noticed the lack of communication from the cockpit. Attempts to contact the pilots went unanswered. Concern quickly turned to alarm as emergency indicators flashed on their panels. Passengers sensed the tension as attendants whispered urgently and moved quickly down the aisle. One attendant made an announcement asking if anyone on board had flight or aviation experience. The cabin fell into a heavy silence. People exchanged worried looks, fear spreading faster than words. Emily felt her heart pounding as she listened. Her hands trembled, but her mind raced through memories of her father's lessons. She knew she was young. She knew it sounded impossible, but she also knew what those alarms meant and what could happen if no one responded. Slowly, she raised her hand. The flight attendant stared at her in disbelief. Emily swallowed hard and spoke softly but clearly. "My dad taught me how to fly a little." As the attendant knelt beside her, the weight of the moment settled in. Somewhere deep inside, Emily felt her father's presence, steady and reassuring, as the aircraft continued flying silently forward. Emily followed the flight attendant down the aisle as frightened passengers watched in silence. The cockpit door opened to a scene that made her stomach tighten. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, unconscious, alarms blinking softly across the control panels. The autopilot was holding the plane steady, just as her father had explained years ago, but time mattered. Emily climbed into the captain's seat, her legs barely reaching the pedals. The headset felt heavy as it was placed over her ears, and a calm voice from air traffic control came through, asking who was in the cockpit. Her voice shook at first as she answered, but she forced herself to slow down. The controller spoke gently, clearly, guiding her step by step. Emily repeated each instruction aloud, just like her father had taught her to do. She checked altitude, speed, and heading, confirming that the autopilot was engaged. Oxygen levels slowly stabilized as emergency systems activated, buying them precious time. Emily's hands trembled over the controls, but her mind focused. Fear was there, but training pushed it aside. Air traffic control cleared nearby airspace and directed the aircraft toward Spokane for an emergency landing. Emily adjusted the heading under instruction, watching the artificial horizon and listening carefully. The controller described every action in simple terms, never rushing her. In the cabin, passengers held hands, whispered prayers, and stared at the ceiling as the plane began its gradual descent. The flight attendants moved quietly, reassuring people as best they could, their own fear hidden behind calm expressions. As the runway came into view through the windshield, Emily's breathing became shallow. She remembered sitting beside her father in a simulator, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he reminded her to trust the process. She lowered the landing gear when instructed, feeling the vibration through the controls. The plane descended faster now, engines responding to her adjustments. The runway lights grew larger, closer. Emily followed the checklist exactly, her voice steady as she confirmed each step. The landing was firm, not smooth, but the wheels touched down safely. The aircraft rolled along the runway as emergency vehicles raced alongside it, lights flashing. When the plane finally came to a stop, the cabin erupted in cries, cheers, and applause. Paramedics rushed into the cockpit to treat the pilots, who began to regain consciousness. Emily removed the headset slowly, her hands finally shaking as the weight of what she had done hit her all at once. When she stepped back into the cabin, every passenger stood. Some were crying openly, others smiling through tears. A flight attendant wrapped Emily in a tight hug. Later, officials would call her actions extraordinary, even heroic. But as Emily sat quietly by the window, watching emergency lights fade into the distance, she thought only of her father. Everything he had taught her had led to this moment, and because of that, every life on that plane had made it home. The days that followed the emergency landing, Emily's life felt unreal. News vans crowded the airport, and reporters repeated her name as if it belonged to someone else. Aviation officials confirmed that a rare oxygen system failure had incapacitated both pilots and praised the quick response of the crew and air traffic controllers. Emily was interviewed gently, always seated beside a flight attendant or a family member. She answered simply, saying she had only done what her father taught her. At night, when everything went quiet, the sound of alarms and voices still echoed in her dreams. The airline arranged for Emily to reunite with her grandparents in Seattle under private security. They hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with pride and relief. Letters began arriving from passengers, handwritten notes filled with gratitude and emotion. One described how Emily's calm voice over the cabin intercom had kept fear from taking over. Another included a photo of a family reunited because of her actions. Emily read every letter carefully, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. Each message reminded her that the flight had not just been a moment, but a turning point for many lives. Investigators later explained that even a few more minutes without intervention could have ended differently. Emily listened quietly as experts spoke about systems and probabilities, but what stayed with her was how fragile everything suddenly felt. She began spending more time studying aviation, not out of pressure, but out of respect. Her father's old notebooks were taken out again, pages worn from use. She practiced in simulators offered by a local flight school, invited by instructors who wanted to support her curiosity, not rush her future. School returned to something close to normal, though classmates looked at her differently now. Some treated her like a hero, others with disbelief. Emily stayed the same, still shy, still thoughtful. She joined an aviation youth program and learned more about teamwork, communication, and responsibility. When asked what she wanted to be someday, she answered honestly that she didn't know yet. She only knew she wanted to be ready, the way her father had taught her to be, for moments that mattered. On the anniversary of the flight, Emily visited a small memorial at a local airfield dedicated to pilots and crew. She stood quietly, hands in her pockets, watching planes take off and disappear into the sky. She wasn't thinking about headlines or praise. She was thinking about preparation, courage, and the strange way life places people where they are needed most. Emily understood now that heroism wasn't about age or titles. It was about listening, learning, and stepping forward when everything depends on you doing so.